What will play well in front of a jury in the upcoming Bryan Kohberger trial? We don't have a date for the trial yet. We don't know when exactly or where, for that matter, it will be taking place officially. But in the pretrial motions, there's a lot that has come out, including IGG evidence. This is evidence that the police used to generate leads, but did not use it to obtain any sort of warrants. A DNA sample on the knife sheath that was found at the crime scene allegedly matched Kohberger's cheek swab. It's a lot of science, a lot of information that a lot of people need to take it. And even those of us who talk about this stuff on a daily basis, it can be very confusing to understand what all of this means. Here to discuss just that and exactly what resonates with potential jurors, Shavaun Scott, psychotherapist and author. IGG evidence, one of those things that they needed to get over to the defense and part of their discovery. But at the end of the day, probably not going to be a real game changer in any sense of the uh, means for this upcoming trial. But let's talk about what are some of the things when it comes to a trial like this that jurors are going to be looking for to determine innocence or guilt.
It's such an unpredictable process because jurors in different locations are remarkably different sometimes. And this is one of the reasons that change of venues are so often sought because, attorneys know that you're going to get a different jury pool in a different location. So it's really hard to say. I think there are people that tend to understand science that are fascinated by it and would probably completely go for it. But so much of, I think, what happens with juries is more on an emotional level.
Mhm.
If the defendant is likable, if there's a plausible story that seems legitimate, I think they go on those emotional decisions more than they realize that they do because all this stuff happens unconsciously. So who knows?
Even more so than the science, you would say. Maybe that also depends on location. Speak to that a little bit, where you're talking about one location can be more like this, one location can be more like that. What do you mean by that?
I know that in the O.J. Simpson trial, location was really something that they paid very close attention to because they wanted to be in an area where people were um, of color and lower income and were more apt to see him as an icon versus an area that was very white
Mhm.
and very conservative.
Okay.
And so that was a pretty open game that they played, and
Mhm.
they got the outcome that they wanted. The people were fans of OJ,
Mhm.
and had a very easy time believing that it was a racist setup. And if that trial had happened in Idaho, you would have had a very different jury.
That's yeah, very true. For something like this with Bryan Kohberger, obviously, we're assuming it will take place in Moscow, Idaho, but that could still be, up in the air. We're not anywhere near the beginning of this trial. What would be an ideal setting if you were Bryan Kohberger? Where would you want this to be taking place?
Um, if Moscow, Idaho is not heavily populated by people who are interested in science, which is a reasonable guess.
Mhm.
It's small area, kind of isolated. It seems like that could possibly be a good situation for him. Um, Now, I would also think that being in a different location where people had not experienced the trauma that everybody in that community experienced from these awful murders, that could be a benefit to him too. So a change of venue could probably benefit him.
Being in a smaller community and having something like this, I mean, you almost think, for lack of a better term, kind of the villagers with pitchforks,
Yeah,
ready to get whoever the police put up there and investigators say, this is our guy, regardless, they're probably going to go after him. There is a
yeah,
mountain of evidence against
yeah.
Kohberger, though, quite a bit. We'll talk about that in just a few seconds. Despite that mountain of evidence, being likable, being personable, two things that we really haven't seen a whole lot of from Kohberger. I mean, in terms of looks, a lot of people have said he looks like an attractive guy. does that play in his favor? But then also you have the kind of cold demeanor that we've seen out of him as well. So kind of one half here, kind of one half there. What's
Yeah.
in his best interest going forward in terms of PR? Because that's kind of half of it,
Yeah.
in terms of his image that he needs to present to potential jurors.
It's huge, it's huge, and they did, we noticed in his more recent court appearances, he had a great haircut, he was dressed very nicely, and he presented well in that way, but he has a, as you say, a very cold demeanor. He, smirks at times that seem inappropriate, he's presents as odd and certainly not very warm and likable, and that has a big impact. Has an impact on people who get jobs. You
Mm,
know, we know that those unconscious things people are noticing, even
mhm,
though they're not able to articulate it. We all know people that we feel are warm and we feel comfortable with them versus people that are just standoffish and, we're just not comfortable with them. And so I think that has a lot to do with what will happen here. And I don't think he has the capacity to come off as a real normal person. I think he always seems to come off as cold, detached, and odd.
how does one present as not the cold, detached, and odd, especially in a situation where you're not really able to speak? He's not speaking very much other than a yes or a no. I'm sure they don't really want him to speak much. How does someone like that convey those sort of properties in oneself, if they're not necessarily innate in them to begin with?
Yeah, so much of it is body language and facial expressions. And again, these are things that we see when we're not aware of. Do they look upset when terrible things are said about them? Are they demonstrating distress at the right moments? Or is it just like, I'm a robot here?
Mhm.
Um, smiling at the wrong time. He does things that at times make him look like I'm just so confident and
Yeah.
in control.
Disabling. Yes.
And yeah,
Yeah.
and people read that. We
Mhm.
all sense it, and it doesn't come off well for this situation.
Some of the other evidence that, of course, is mounting against him, the phone records. What we do know is the triangulation of the phone data, cell phone pinging. Something we don't know a whole lot about yet is exactly the contents of those devices. The Google search histories. That's something
Yeah,
that's been so damning for so many people, even I
yeah,
would say sometimes stronger than DNA, because it
yeah,
really gets into one's mind and tells you,
exactly.
what are they thinking? What are they saying out loud? What are they not saying
Very
out loud?
much.
I'm very much wondering how much or what that will reveal once this goes to trial.
I agree with you. I think that is more powerful for jurors than the DNA because it shows the thought process. And we know that when there are violent crimes, there's usually a buildup of, the fantasies, the thinking about it, the research about it. And this is generally very accessible if you can get into somebody's internet history. So I think that's incredibly important. I've been very curious about that.
What about the eyewitness account? That's one that I know I'm sure the defense will try and poke a lot of holes into. Memory can be flawed quite often with people. And there's just that one eyewitness account of the housemate reported seeing the masked man whose physical
Mhm,
description, as best as we can tell, with a mask on, matched Kohberger's, at least
mhm,
height and bushy
mhm,
eyebrows.
mhm.
How well does that play with a jury in terms of today? I can see it being very strong years ago before we had all these other more technical ways of looking at things and scientific ways of looking at things. But do eyewitness accounts still hold the same weight that they once did?
I think again, it depends on the juror. If
Mhm.
it's somebody that studied the, research about how memory can be flawed, but I don't think most people study that material. And so eyewitness accounts, particularly in the context of all these other things, very likely will be significant. And again, it's just another piece
Mhm.
of the puzzle here. And there are so many things that line up.
Does his background being a criminology student, does that play against him or for him? Because one could say, well, he's studying criminology. He's someone out there who wants to find justice for those who have been wronged. He's trying to be a good guy, if you will.
Mhm.
It can also be read the other direction of, well, he's learning
Mhm.
how to use the system as well and become an expert
Mhm.
on it
Mhm.
from behind the scenes.
Mhm. Yeah, I don't know that that's going to be a benefit here. I think there are three reasons people study criminology, and one is exactly what you said. I care about society. I want to make the world a safer place, so they're altruistic. Another reason is that they're fascinated with the criminal mind, and a lot of times that has to do, I think, for many of us, it's a way of understanding, are there things here that we can control? And is it a way to feel safe in the
Mhm.
world? Because we understand these things. And then there's also the very dark reason, which is because they want to become a better criminal and they're fascinated with law enforcement and how to circumvent it. And there have been other serial killers who had criminology degrees.
Mhm.
The Golden State Killer in California, who went on to become a cop, and the BTK killer who had a bachelor's degree in criminology. And so I don't think it's going to serve him in this situation.
One of the things that we don't know if it'll be brought up, but if we look back to his studies with Kathleen Ramsland at DeSales University, was those questions that he put out online asking former criminals or current criminals to answer for his research. Some of those questions. And let me ask you this: are these normal questions to ask? Because to someone on the outside, you go, that seems pretty incriminating considering the context of all this. But if you're trying to study this, maybe it does
Yeah.
make more sense.
Yeah.
Why did you choose that
Yeah.
victim or target over
Yeah.
others after
Yeah.
committing the crime? What were you thinking or feeling? Are
Exactly.
those normal questions to be
They
studying?
yes,
They are.
yes,
Okay.
they really are, and those are the exact kinds of questions that when I was working with forensic patients who had done awful things, those were exactly the questions I would ask
Hmm.
because you're looking for the pattern in the criminal thinking,
Hmm.
and there are always patterns. And if you're trying to come up with ways to intervene with people, you want to understand where do they veer off and where do they go into abnormal, ways of thinking and behaving. So it is normal in that sense. But again, when it's in the context of all these other things, it leaves us with a very creepy feeling.
Without a doubt, it'll be very interesting in 2024 to see where all of this goes. I think at the end of the day, though, my money is on Google. There's all
Yeah.
these questions about the DNA and the
Yeah.
knife sheath and this or that. The Google search history, I think
Yes.
that's going to tell us far more and probably blow a lot of minds more than anything
Yeah.
else that we know about right now.
Yeah, and fortunately, it doesn't say, I mean, we have no information that he destroyed his hard drive or
No.
anything, as sometimes people do before they do something awful.
Mhm.
But again, that would indicate that he thought he was going to get away with it.
True.
So,
It will be very interesting to watch.
mhm.
Hey, it's Tony Brueski. If you want more of our interview with our guests, be sure to check out our podcast, Hidden Killers with Tony Brueski. Just search that wherever you download podcasts and press subscribe. Also, you can check out our YouTube channel for the full video version of the interviews as well, under the same name, Hidden Killers with Tony Brueski. Check it out, subscribe, binge, and enjoy. Thanks for watching.